The war in Eastern Europe has gone through many phases to date, but the most striking stage in the Ukrainian war took place today. After weeks of preparation, the Ukrainian counter-offensive began after the shaping operations. Analysts believe Ukraine is currently in the early stages of its counterattack. Several Russian sources notice a dramatic increase in fire and attacks against their positions in the Zaporizhzhia direction during the night. Russian sources state that tanks attacked their positions and the bombardment continued non-stop. Tonight, all Russian military correspondents announced that Ukraine has launched the same counter-offensive in the direction of Zaporizhzhia. Today, Russian sources reported that there was a major offensive of the armed forces of Ukraine in the direction of Zaporizhzhia in the Orakov and Malaya-Tokmak region. Ukrainian forces broke through the Russian lines and began to penetrate into the Russian front lines. Reports speak of an offensive by the Ukrainian army which sent the main forces into battle. It is claimed that the attack was supported by large artillery fire and HIMARS. After intense artillery preparation using various weapons, including self-propelled guns and Western-style towed howitzers, Ukrainian troops began to attack at dusk, east of the city of Orakov in the Zaporizhzhia region. Russian military correspondents reported that the return fire was very intense, including air strikes about 2.5 hours after the start of the war. The intensity of Russian attacks began to decrease significantly. Half an hour later, the second wave of the Ukrainian counter-offensive began. The final major attack was reportedly carried out in the direction of Malaya-Tokmak. Around 4 a.m., in fact, activity in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast had intensified in recent days. At least 6 explosions were heard near Russian-occupied Melitopol in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast the other day. At least 1 explosion was also reported on a railway in the Dolinsk district near Melitopol. Russian forces use this railway to transport military equipment and personnel. The biggest purpose of the Ukrainian armed forces attacking the railways is to disrupt Russia's supply lines. Russia's mostly heavily fortified frontline area is the southern province of Zaporizhzhia, where Ukraine is expected to attempt to break and cut the land bridge connecting Russian territory to occupied Crimea. There, Russian forces created a multi-layered defense consisting of anti-tank trenches, zigzag trenches, concrete dragon teeth, barricades, steel, hedgehog barriers, razor wire, and minefields. Russian forces are moving concrete pyramidal anti-tank structures known as Dragon's Teeth through Mariupol towards the town of Razivka in the Zaporizhzhia region. Video and photos showing the anti-tank structures being loaded and transported on trucks were shared on Telegram by the mayor of Ukraine, Petro and Ryashchenko. We will see in the coming days whether these anti-tank structures, which are a concrete reflection of the fear of the Russians, will work. However, the Ukrainian armed forces frequently share training videos that show that they have the potential to crush these fortifications with the Western tanks in their inventory. Also, Russia paid special attention to the Berdyansk airport near the Sea of Azov. The airport is known as a hub for Russian military aircraft. Last week, Russian officials claimed that Ukrainian forces had launched a massive offensive in Berdyansk. On the other hand, Russia, unable to prevent the Ukrainian attacks on the front lines, is watching desperately the attack in its own cities. Belgorod is one of the regions where cross-border attacks are most intense. The Russian city of Shebekino, a stone's throw from the Ukrainian border, has been under heavy Ukrainian bombardment in recent days. Shebekino residents flee and are evacuated. The Russian Volunteer Corps group attacked the town of Shebekino and the administrative building in the Belgorod region. The attack took place around 3 o'clock Moscow time after the massive bombing of civilian facilities in the Belgorod region. The Russian Volunteer Corps group attacked Russian territory near the Novaya Olshanka and Shebekino International Road checkpoint with 2 motorized infantry divisions reinforced with tanks. In a statement made by the Russian Ministry of Defense, it was stated that the attack was repelled by Russian soldiers. Also, limited raids and border bombardments in Belgorod Oblast are becoming the focus of criticism of the Russian military leadership. Wagner Group commander Yevgeny Prigozhin continued to use the situation in Belgorod Oblast to criticize the Ministry of Defense. On June 3rd and 4th, Prigozhin especially drew attention to the lack of response from the Russian Defense Minister, Zaporizhzhia. Colonel General Alexander Lapin and the chief of the Russian General Staff Commander Prigozhin offered to negotiate the release of prisoners of war held by the SSC and LSR if the Russian authorities failed to do so. The Wagner leader sarcastically responded to criticism of his proposal, saying that Russia has a problem with brave people. In another development, a critical dam on the Dnipro River in southern Ukraine collapsed overnight, putting thousands of people living downstream in danger. Residents of the riverside fishing villages and low-lying neighborhoods of Kherson were evacuated by bus and train as a result of the evacuations. Approximately 4,000 people remained in the region, which had a population of 13,000 before the flood. It was not immediately clear who committed the breach. Ukraine blamed Russia, saying there was an explosion in an engine room. Russia said that Ukrainian forces carried out a sabotage attack. The disaster came a day after American and Russian officials said a planned Ukrainian counter-offensive had begun in the Donetsk region east of Dnipro. The flood can divert the attention and resources of both sides from this counterattack. The dam and its surrounding infrastructure located in the South Kherson area close to the war front, were damaged by shelling throughout the war. Last year, Russian forces took control of the dam and a nearby hydroelectric power station. It seems that the destruction of war is getting more and more striking with each passing day. What happened, both on the front lines and behind the front lines, wears out Russia in particular. Although the Russian army is the second largest army in the world, it is losing its superiority in the war with Ukraine and is losing heavy ammunition and weapons on many fronts. However, this is an issue that the Russian army takes the risk of and is far from being the main problem. The main problem is that the soldiers of the Russian army can leave the war at any time, and the morale and weariness caused by the failure and excessively harsh administration in the army. Russia's senseless war, which drew the reaction of the whole world, has been going on for almost 4 months, and thanks to the strong resistance of Ukraine, Russia could not make any progress in the war in Ukraine. Even now, Russia has begun to lose the areas it occupied. In addition to the psychological weight of the heavy defeat in the region, the soldiers of the Russian forces are also very disturbed by Moscow's attitude towards them. Some Russian elite special forces left their areas, while others began to refuse to go to the front in Ukraine. In fact, according to the audio recordings obtained by the Ukrainian intelligence, it is stated that some Russian soldiers came to a psychological point ready to kill the generals who led the attacks. Last week, Russian National Guard Gvardiya elite soldiers were formally dismissed after they rejected their duties to participate in Russian President Vladimir Putin's internationally condemned military action against Ukraine. This elite military unit was seen as a unit that was expected to be of great use in Ukraine and would lead Russian operations. At the same time, Rosgvardia was described as Putin's special unit. However, this unit refused to participate in the war in Ukraine and was therefore punished and dismissed by Putin. The soldiers objected to the decision, which included the dismissal of 115 elite Russian soldiers. However, the Russian courts found this decision justified and stated that the soldiers should fight at the front when their state needed it. The situation in the Russian army at the moment is so deplorable that Russian commanders prefer to protect equipment rather than save the lives of wounded Russian troops on the battlefield. It is also stated that materiel and artillery support was not provided to the troops that went too far. The Ukrainian Military Intelligence Directorate reported that Russian commanders are trying to protect military equipment by forbidding drivers to evacuate wounded soldiers or to supply supplies to troops that have gone too far, refusing to risk equipment to evacuate wounded personnel on the battlefield and not allowing the evacuation of the wounded can undoubtedly be considered a flagrant violation of military professionalism. Considering Russia's harsh stance and the dismayed state of the soldiers from this war, Putin's dream became more impossible with each passing day and started to turn into a nightmare for Putin. After all, Russia may even lose Crimea along with Donetsk and Luhansk at the end of this war. For the sake of Putin's ambitions, many civilians were harmed and civilian infrastructures were destroyed in Ukraine, which was taken by the Russian army for the invasion attempt on February 24th. There was no logical or valid reason for this. At the same time, over 30,000 soldiers from both Ukraine and Russia lost their lives. Russian military personnel losses, which are now over 33,000, continue to increase. For this reason, the fact that Russian troops did not participate in the Ukrainian war does not seem like a questionable situation. According to the court, the arbitrary refusal of soldiers to fulfill an official duty corresponds to such an important issue as to deprive them of their military service. Also, while the Russians appear to largely support Putin's actions targeting his Eastern European neighbors, there have been signs of discontent and opposition since the start of the full-scale invasion in February. In the early days of the war, thousands of anti-war protesters across the country were arrested by the Russian authorities. Some lawmakers and members of the Russian elite also openly opposed the attack on Ukraine. As a result of these protests, Russia's heavy sanctions against the opposition came to light. A certain section of the Russian population, unwilling to participate in Putin's unjust war, rejected the war. Leonid Vashukevich, a member of the Communist Party faction, reported that he called on Putin to stop the months-long war. The call also included the withdrawal of Russian troops from Eastern Europe, drawing attention to the young people who die every day. Vashukevich stated that as a result of stopping Putin, the number of orphans in the country will increase, and they do not want this. At the same time, we need to look deeply at the cracks in the Russian army, which we briefly touched upon at the beginning. The Ukrainian armed forces said in a statement that Russian soldiers were ready to kill the generals who led the attacks. The statement claims that the Russian forces almost killed General Valery Salyuk and his bodyguards, who came to the Donetsk region to encourage the troops at the front. So how can such an event take place within the world's second-largest army? The soldiers refused to obey the order and were ready to blow up the high guests. That's why the Russian general fled from the front in embarrassment, wagging his tail, it said. It was stated that this was evidenced by a phone call received by the Ukrainian security service of a Russian soldier named Zaporizhzhia and his wife. As a summary of the conversation, the Russian general who came for encouragement was forcing the Russian soldiers to attack Donbass. However, only 215 soldiers remained from the 600-strong BG. This could only be a suicide mission. All the soldiers in BG refused to fight and were willing to be killed there. Russian soldiers in BG were threatened with guns to attack, and even Russian Spetsnaz pointed guns at them. Russian soldiers. Obnetchayev's last sentence in the conversation with his wife was, "That's all. Even Spetsnaz, Russian special forces, pointed guns at us and we pointed guns at them. In short, we almost shot each other." Then he got in his car and drove off. Said, it is also known that Russian military units have been fighting in the region for a long time due to insufficient equipment and feeding conditions. In fact, a soldier who has been in the region since the first days of the war, who later returned to his country, states that the Russian army's lack of equipment is unbelievable when they go to the region. The soldier states that they are not even provided with night vision and that this is not a very costly expense for Russia. Russian soldiers stated that they saw the Russian army as the largest army in the world before the war. But now they say that they understand that this thought is very wrong. One of the soldiers who was in Russia for compulsory military service states that he signed a professional contract and joined the Russian army for 2 years. He emphasizes that they were taken to the region to carry out exercises around Ukraine before February 24th, and then they hastily crossed the Ukrainian border and started the attack. However, after crossing the Ukrainian border and facing intense Ukrainian attacks and bombardments, he states that even that day he understood that the Russian army would lose. He says they are constantly bombarded both on the go and when parked at night. In his 50-man unit, 10 people were killed and 10 injured. Almost all of his comrades were under the age of 25. Soldiers say most of the casualties were due to Russia's haste. He reports that they advanced without any protection behind them and did not even conduct minesweepers. He says that if these had been accomplished, we would have lost far fewer soldiers. Realizing that they were only used as bait in the region where they were exiled as recruits, the soldier later returned to Russia. Lawsuits were brought against him, but they were not continued. If you notice, the general psychology of the Russian soldiers seems to be summarized over a single soldier. Most of the Russian soldiers thought they would only conduct one exercise around Ukraine before February 24th, and many of them found themselves in the war without even saying goodbye to their families. There have been comments that Putin is walking a youth to death for the sake of his own ambitions, and not reverting from this mistake will cause many more Russian young people to be in that war unintentionally, maybe even killed, maybe even die. Regardless, both Ukrainian and Russian soldiers are victims of Putin, and when we look at the centuries-long history of World War, there is never a winner. However, there is much to be lost. We hope that, first of all, Ukrainian and Russian families and soldiers will find peace and Ukraine will preserve the territorial integrity and freedom it deserves. A lot of things happened between Soledar and Siversk. After the Russians established control over Soledar, they said it has to a large extent changed, and the Ukrainians needed to adjust their defense line in order to be in a better position to protect the Siversk group, and keeping the Russians as far from Siversk as possible is extremely important because Siversk is mainly used for supply and support of the offensive group in the forest that is storming Crimea. As I told you last time, the forest is where the Ukrainians got the closest to Crimea. So if the safety of the roads and passages that lead to the forest through Siversk is undermined, the Ukrainians will have a lot of problems. Right now, the Russians to the south are still at a safe distance from these crucial roads. And in order to keep it that way, the Ukrainians started improving their tactical position with respect to the possible axis of the Russian advance. The first possible axis of advance is from Berestovo towards Spirin. The Russians already used Berestovo to attack Spirina from the south, and the reason why this axis is so preferable for the Russians lies in the topography. If you look at the topographic map, we can see that the Ukrainians in Spirin have a lot of positions on the hills. It is therefore extremely difficult to attack it in front from Nikolaevka, which is located in the lowlands. The Russians can and do assault it from the oil refinery, which is almost at the same elevation. But a supporting attack from Berestovo would improve their chances of success even more. The Ukrainians are countering it by doing two things. Firstly, they created many defensive positions around the settlement. This way, even if the enemy decides to attack from multiple directions at once, they will still be far enough from each other in order to focus just on the enemy that is in front of them and allow other units to deal with the enemy in the back. That is why, for the last month, there were a lot of clashes for the substation that is located to the northeast of Spirin, which the Ukrainians successfully took. Secondly, today, the Ukrainians assaulted Russian positions near Berestovo in order to improve their tactical position even more. The attack was successful and the Ukrainians reportedly established control over a powerful fortification to the southeast of Spirin. Now the Ukrainians have even greater control over the local heights, which allows rebuffing Russian attacks more easily. Moreover, this made it much harder for the Russians to use the second axis of advance from Berestovo towards the cellar. The Russians had already tried to attack Vasily from Berestovo in the past, but at that time they did not have enough control over the ground to achieve any success, mainly because crossing the railway embankments proved to be extremely costly. Now the Russians have the possibility to attack, and they do attack partially from Yakovlevka, which is why they might be willing to risk it and open a supporting attack from Berestovo. However, as the Ukrainians establish control over this triangle, the Ukrainians in Ivanovka and Bohemika gained more freedom of movement and could maintain positions closer to the embankment, basically eliminating the possibility of a flank attack. That the Russians are developing an offensive operation along the front lines of the north of Solidarity. Here they're attacking Vesela and Rosolova, and their goal is to move up to Siversk. However, even though the settlements themselves are located in the lowlands, the Ukrainians are controlling the heights right behind them. So every Russian advance is seen and taken under fire control in order to boost their tactical position. The Ukrainian command reinforced this defense line with 3,000 additional troops. Apart from digging trenches and fortifying their positions, one of the most important things that they are doing is establishing additional observation posts. This way they expand fire control over the region, as they can precisely and rapidly correct artillery fire on the advancing Russian forces. Overall, the Ukrainians have significantly diminished the risk of a successful flank attack from Berestovo. Now the Russians in Berestovo can only engage in positional fights, which, apart from fixing troops, do not contribute to the offensive operation. The Ukrainians have also reinforced and continue to fortify the next defense line that goes along the local hills. Given the local geography, most of the fights should take place in the fields. This forces both parties to operate along the ravines, tribal areas, roads and highways, which sets conditions for head-on battles and artillery duels.